All right, making myself a pedestal. Let me see. I can do a gradation. I can do it noisy or solid. I can play with the smoothness of it and then drop it in. But I want it on the really low side of the spectrum, something like this. Oh, not quite like that. Like this. And I can always play with its opacity as well. Remember, you can move selections around. So I can take that selection and I can pull that as a chunk from my flipped exposure. I can even move that selection. Get a little bit of the shirt here. Duplicate that, move it down. Photoshop gives us control of every pixel, and when you have that kind of control, there's very little you can't do. But you need to know where you're getting your pixels from and how that works. Now, just like I erased around my image, I can erase around the pedestal. Also, we're using multiple layers, and if we want to, we can combine them into two. So if I work with this pedestal with both the cutout of my shirt and this red gradation, and I want to play with them, with slightly different opacities and edges, like so. Like this. And I don't want to have to erase from each of them individually. Instead, just treat them all together. I can merge layers, and we have that ability as well with Photoshop. And that shortcut is just Command E, but you can also find it under the layer options. Every once in a while you want to save your project, and this is going to be Carl Frey, assignment 3, Serrano portrait, because I'm inspired by an Andres Serrano portrait, to the desktop. All right, so if I want to take both these layers and be able to work with them together, I can simply select them both, go to Layer and say Merge Layers, shortcut Command E. And now they're all on one layer that I can just erase from all at once, putting it together. And that also allows me to do things like play with their levels all together. Their darkness, their lightness. Like so. Okay. So now that I've got the format pretty much in place, bless you, bless you. Now comes the difficult work of getting the lighting to match. And I'm not talking about the red. The color is one of the easiest things to process in photography, in digital photography. I'm talking about the lighting direction, where the lights appear here and how that's different on my exposure. And this is going to be needed to be adjusted for all of you. No matter how great your exposure is, professional photographs are always processed in this way, with what's called dodging and burning. So, let me show you what I mean. I'm going to keep all of this. I'm just going to turn it off for the time being. So I have my pedestal, I have my shoulder, but I just want to work with one exposure for the time being. And I want to try to match that lighting. So what you can tell is that my face needs to be lit more in a few areas. And if I do this on a new layer, just a new blank layer, this is just to show you, this isn't actually how you do it. It's basically like painting. So if I want more light, here I'm painting with yellow. I'm basically going to want to bring out more exposure, rather less exposure, so it's brighter. There, maybe a little bit right there. The chin and the nose looks pretty good. Maybe I broaden the highlight on the nose a little bit. I have good highlight on this shoulder here. It looks like I need a little bit more highlight rimmed around there and around this shoulder. Maybe I should put that shoulder in. In fact, I could use this opportunity to combine them, to put these two layers together. Command E. Lovely. And so this is why we're using the stylus, to kind of identify. And then in my hair, I need a lot more highlight in my hair. And you can use your lighting sketch to show you where this is needed. So that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm just going to use the right tools in the right way to get it. And so instead of painting on a layer like that, which really changes your pixels and blasts out and obscures my exposure, instead I'm going to do this in adjustment, not really adjustment layers, in mask layers. And instead of using specialized clipping masks in Photoshop, I'm going to do it this way. Make a new blank layer using a little post-it note in your layers above your exposure. This is after you've adjusted your exposure with its regular histogram already, with levels, and I got more brightness out of it. But now I'm going to call this, double click it, my dodging layer. And it's a dodging overlay layer. Then I am going to fill that layer, edit fill, with middle gray. So use 50% gray, normal mode, 100%. Or if I want, I can even make it overlay mode right here, because it's going to be overlay mode eventually. Okay. Now what that does, actually making it overlay mode when I set it up didn't seem to do anything. I still had to do overlay mode here. What that does is I still see my portrait just fine, no problem. But when I use the dodging tool, which looks like a little black lollipop, and I adjust its brush just like I would for painting, and instead of opacity, I have this exposure slider, and I want to use exposures that are less than 30, a percentage less than 30. And I want a brush that's always soft, fairly large, and I want to start affecting the midtones. So those are the settings. And it's nice to have this checked for protect tones. Then I'm just going to very gently with my stylus start painting those areas. And what you'll see is that it increases the lights in those areas very gently. If I think it's going too fast, I can take the exposure level down. And it does it just by bringing out the pixels that are already there. Now, whenever we make changes like this, we tend to overdo it. And this is why we're not doing it to our actual layer. We're doing it to an overlay layer on top. And that way, you see the dodge overlay here? That way we can actually adjust its opacity. So that's with nothing, that's with everything. What's right is probably somewhere in between. Now you have to be careful with dodging, because it also tends, especially with skin tones, to make things a little bit more saturated. So you see how my skin's starting to get really yellowish and pinkish where I'm dodging, especially on the projector there. Yikes. So there's another tool that you sometimes have to use to work with it, and that tool is called the sponge tool, and it's in the same drawer with dodge and burn. So if I go to the sponge tool, use a similar soft brush, a similar low-powered flow, and the mode I want is desaturate, to take color away. And I'm just going to slowly hit those areas where I dodged. But it's easy to do it too much and end up with black and white. Right? That's why it's better to get the lighting right as close as possible in your exposure, rather than trying to fix it with dodging and overlay. You see a little bit more of my layers. Okay, so you see here's my exposure. Here's my exposure with some of that sponge work to take some of that extra pigment out in some areas, so that when I brighten it, it doesn't look too out of place. Now I need a lot of it in the hair, right? So I've done this part. Now I need to do that. So I go back to my dodging overlay, I go to my dodge tool, I'm doing mid-tones only, doing it only at 10%. And my hair is pretty dark, but because I had a good balanced exposure, I'm able to bring out that content and extend that lighting up over my head. In the way that's going to match my reference. So these are very powerful tools. We tend to overuse them. The other place, on the shoulder here. Now the computer doesn't know any difference between me and the background, so it's also going to be dodging the midtones in the background. But that's okay, because I have a background replacement up here. You know, that I'll work with later. If it saturates the color too much, then I go to the exposure copy underneath, and I use the sponge to desaturate that. Like the shirt was getting too colorful here, so I'm going to sponge it down. The sponge actually is from the darkroom too. That's where you use a sponge to remove the processing chemicals in the different color baths when you're processing color photography. So, pretty big difference from this to this, right? Just to try to match that lighting. Now, just like we did the